The cowboy gave water to an Apache woman. At dawn, his valley filled with riders. Why would one simple act of kindness lead to such an extraordinary sight the very next morning? And what could have brought so many riders into a single valley at dawn? Hello, everyone, and welcome back. If you enjoy unforgettable Old West stories filled with mystery, heart, and timeless lessons, you are in the right place. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another journey into the American frontier. Thank you for watching, for your support, and for being part of this growing community. Now, tell us in the comments, if you had only one canteen of water left, would you have shared it with a stranger? With that question in mind, let us ride back to a quiet desert trail where everything began. A man can cross an entire desert with an empty holster, but no soul survives long with an empty heart. Ethan Calloway had heard those words from his father when he was just a boy, and on the hottest afternoon of that unforgiving summer, they echoed louder than the wind itself. The Arizona sun hung over the valley like molten brass, pressing its weight onto every rock, every cactus, every tired breath that struggled against the dry air. Dust drifted across the narrow trail in lazy spirals, and even Ethan's bay gelding lowered its head with each slow step, its flanks damp beneath the worn leather saddle. The canteen hanging from Ethan's saddle horn felt lighter than it had an hour ago. He pulled it free, tilted it gently, and listened to the faint slosh inside. Barely enough for one man to reach home. Maybe less. The nearest spring was still nearly 12 miles away, and the heat shimmered across the open country until the distant hills looked like ghosts floating above the earth. Most men would have turned their horse toward the ranch without another thought. Most men would have remembered every warning spoken inside Miller's Crossing over the past few years. Don't stop for strangers. Don't trust anyone wearing Apache colors. Keep riding and mind your own business. Ethan had never been very good at following advice that asked him to ignore another human being. His horse suddenly slowed without command. Its ears stood forward. Something moved beside a cluster of sandstone boulders overlooking the trail. At first, Ethan thought it was only a piece of faded cloth caught against the rocks. Then he saw a hand. He climbed down carefully, his boots sinking into powdery dust, every sound swallowed by the endless silence of the valley. The smell of hot stone mixed with dry sage drifted through the still air as he stepped closer. A young Apache woman lay against the shaded side of the rocks, her breathing shallow, her face pale beneath the dust that clung to her skin. Her lips were cracked from thirst, and one trembling hand rested weakly across her chest as though she no longer had the strength to lift it. Her dark eyes opened only slightly when his shadow reached her. Fear appeared first, then exhaustion replaced it. Neither of them spoke. They didn't share the same language well enough for explanations, and perhaps explanations no longer mattered. Ethan looked down at the nearly empty canteen in his hand. Home was hours away. Without that water, the ride back would become dangerous. His horse shifted nervously behind him as if waiting for the decision. He uncorked the canteen anyway. Kneeling beside her, he lifted it slowly, careful not to spill a single drop. She hesitated only a heartbeat before taking the smallest sip imaginable, followed by another. Not greedy, not desperate, grateful. The silence between them somehow said more than words ever could. When the canteen was lowered, she reached into the folds of her weathered shawl with trembling fingers and placed a simple leather bracelet into Ethan's palm. Its faded beads had nearly lost their color after years beneath the desert sun, but one small turquoise stone still caught the light like a tiny piece of morning sky. Ethan started to hand it back, but she gently closed his fingers around it before rising unsteadily to her feet. She looked at him one last time with an expression he couldn't understand, mounted a waiting horse hidden beyond the rocks, and disappeared into the endless desert without leaving so much as another footprint behind. Ethan slipped the bracelet into his pocket, believing he had just traded his last drink of water for an old piece of leather. Before sunrise, he would discover it was worth far more than an entire valley. The ride home felt longer than any Ethan Calloway could remember. The desert had not changed, yet something inside him had. Every few miles his hand drifted toward the small leather bracelet resting safely in his jacket pocket, turning it over with his fingers as though it might reveal why a stranger had valued it more than words. The turquoise bead caught the fading sunlight whenever he looked at it, glowing softly against the worn leather. It did not seem expensive. It did not seem remarkable. Yet he could not bring himself to throw it away. By the time the first golden light of evening stretched across the valley, his modest ranch came into view. A weathered barn leaned slightly toward the cottonwood trees beside the dry creek bed, while a narrow cabin stood alone against the vast open land. It was the kind of place travelers barely noticed, built by steady hands rather than deep pockets. Ethan unsaddled his horse, rubbed the animal's neck with quiet gratitude, and poured the final splash of water into the trough before there was nothing left inside the canteen. He smiled to himself. Tomorrow he would ride to the spring before sunrise. Tonight would simply be another dry evening. As darkness settled over the valley, familiar sounds slowly replaced the silence of the desert. Crickets sang beneath the porch. The old windmill creaked with every gentle breeze. Somewhere beyond the fence line, a lone coyote called into the growing night. Ethan lit a small oil lamp and sat beside the window, repairing a loose leather strap on his saddle. His life had always been simple. Wake before dawn, care for the horses, mend what was broken, sleep beneath a roof built with his own hands. There was comfort in that rhythm, even if it left little room for excitement. The bracelet rested beside the lamp, its tiny turquoise stone reflecting the warm flame. Every so often Ethan glanced toward it without knowing why. Hours passed. Then the horses outside shifted. It was subtle at first, a single hoof against packed dirt, then another. His gelding was not frightened easily. Years on the frontier had taught the animal to ignore coyotes, storms, and wandering cattle. Yet now it snorted softly and turned toward the eastern ridge. Ethan stepped onto the porch. Cool air had replaced the day's brutal heat, carrying the scent of sage across the valley. He listened carefully. Nothing. Only wind. Only darkness stretching for miles beneath a sky overflowing with stars. He almost laughed at himself before noticing the ranch dog standing perfectly still near the gate. The old shepherd was usually asleep by this hour, but now its ears pointed toward the distant hills, every muscle tense without a single bark escaping its throat. Ethan followed its gaze. At first he saw only shadows. Then he noticed something strange along the horizon. A faint ribbon of dust floated beneath the moonlight where no dust should have been after sunset. It disappeared almost immediately, swallowed by darkness before he could be certain it had ever existed. He remained outside another minute before convincing himself it had simply been the evening wind rolling across the valley floor. Returning inside, he hung the bracelet on a small wooden peg beside the front door, thinking little of it. The turquoise bead swung gently as the cabin settled into silence. Ethan blew out the lamp and closed his eyes, unaware that far beyond the eastern ridge, dozens of riders had already begun moving through the night without torches, without voices, and without missing the narrow trail that led straight toward his lonely valley. Ethan awoke before the sun, just as he had every morning for nearly 15 years, but something about the air felt different before his boots even touched the wooden floor. The cabin was unusually still. No breeze slipped through the cracks in the walls. No birds greeted the coming dawn from the cottonwood branches outside. Only a strange, waiting silence rested over the valley. He pulled on his hat, reached for the empty canteen hanging beside the door, and paused as his eyes caught the leather bracelet gently swaying from its peg. It had not moved the night before. Now it rocked almost imperceptibly, though the room held no wind. Ethan slipped it into his pocket without thinking and stepped outside. The eastern horizon glowed with the pale blue light that came only minutes before sunrise. A thin layer of cool morning air rested over the grass, carrying the earthy scent of dew that disappeared quickly in the Arizona heat. His horse stood near the fence, alert but calm, staring toward the distant ridge. The old ranch dog remained beside the gate exactly where Ethan had left him the night before. Its ears were raised. Its eyes never blinked. Then Ethan heard it. Not voices, not gunfire, only the soft, distant rhythm of hoofbeats. So faint they almost blended with the heartbeat inside his own chest. He climbed onto the split-rail fence for a better view. At first there was nothing except the gray outline of rolling hills. Then a ribbon of dust appeared above the eastern ridge, rising slowly into the cool morning sky. It was too steady to be cattle, too broad to be a single rider. Ethan narrowed his eyes as the first rays of sunlight spilled across the valley floor. Shapes slowly emerged inside the drifting dust. One rider, then another, then 5 more. They moved with remarkable precision, each horse maintaining perfect distance from the next. There was no shouting, no hurried movement. The line simply continued growing as more riders appeared from behind the ridge. Ethan climbed down from the fence, his expression calm, though questions filled his mind. Travelers rarely crossed this valley, and never in numbers like these. Within minutes, the narrow line became dozens. Then dozens became what looked like an endless procession stretching farther than his eyes could follow. Sunlight reflected softly from polished bridles and carefully woven blankets. The horses walked rather than charged, their measured pace creating a deep rolling sound that echoed gently through the valley like distant thunder before a summer storm. Ethan noticed something even stranger. No rifles were raised. No one waved. Every rider faced forward in complete silence. Even from nearly half a mile away, their discipline was unmistakable. The old dog finally released a low whine before retreating beneath the porch, while Ethan's gelding remained perfectly still, almost as though it recognized something its owner could not. Ethan rested one hand against the fence post, feeling the rough grain beneath his fingers as he counted without realizing it. 20, 40, 60. More riders continued appearing over the ridge until they covered the valley floor like a slow-moving river of leather, horses, and morning light. His lonely ranch suddenly stood at the center of something far larger than himself. Across the valley, another sound drifted through the crisp air. A church bell from Miller's Crossing rang once, then again, followed by the hurried barking of dogs and the distant voices of townspeople waking to the same impossible sight. Ethan looked down at the bracelet resting in his hand. The tiny turquoise stone sparkled beneath the rising sun, and for the first time he wondered whether the woman had truly left him a gift, or whether she had left behind a promise that had finally come to collect its meaning. The valley seemed to hold its breath as the endless column of riders continued its silent approach beneath the rising sun. Golden light spilled across the desert floor, catching the polished edges of bridles, woven blankets, and long black horse manes that swayed gently with every measured step. There were no battle cries, no raised weapons, and no hurried commands carried on the wind. Only the steady rhythm of hundreds of hooves pressing softly against the earth with remarkable discipline. Ethan Calloway remained beside his fence, one hand resting on the weathered rail, unable to look away. The riders finally reached the broad meadow below his ranch and slowed together as though guided by a single invisible signal. Dust drifted around them in pale clouds before settling back onto the valley grass. Then every horse stopped. At exactly the same moment, the silence that followed felt heavier than thunder. Across the open fields, people from Miller's Crossing had begun gathering along the distant road. Farmers abandoned wagons loaded with hay. Shopkeepers left their front doors open. Mothers stood beside their children with anxious eyes fixed on the valley below. Sheriff Amos Granger arrived at the front of the growing crowd, his gray horse breathing hard from the fast ride out of town. He removed his hat and stared across the meadow without speaking. During 30 years wearing a badge, he had seen cattle drives, army patrols, and traveling caravans, but never anything like this. One of the older ranchers stepped beside him and whispered, "They are waiting for something." Nobody answered because everyone had reached the same conclusion. The only question was what? Ethan noticed that every rider faced the direction of his ranch. Not the town, not the road. His ranch alone. The realization settled quietly inside him. He glanced toward the bracelet resting in his pocket before looking back across the valley. A cool breeze finally stirred, carrying the smell of leather, horses, and desert sage together across the morning air. Somewhere high above, a hawk circled lazily against the pale blue sky as though even the wildlife had paused to witness whatever was about to happen. Several long minutes passed. No rider moved. No horse wandered from its place. Their patience seemed almost impossible. Sheriff Granger finally urged his horse a few cautious steps forward before stopping again, clearly uncertain whether to continue. Even from the distance, Ethan could see the sheriff lower his reins instead of reaching toward his sidearm. Instinct told him that haste would only dishonor the strange stillness covering the valley. Then movement finally came from the center of the assembled riders. One horse stepped forward. Then another remained behind while a single woman continued riding alone through the wide corridor that quietly opened before her. She wore the same weathered shawl Ethan remembered from the previous afternoon, though now it had been carefully brushed clean of desert dust. Morning sunlight reflected softly against the turquoise beads woven into her dark hair. Her posture was calm, steady, and unmistakably confident. Ethan recognized her before she had crossed half the meadow. It was the woman whose life had depended upon the last water inside his canteen. She guided her horse toward the ranch at an unhurried walk, never breaking eye contact with the man standing beside the old wooden fence. Behind her, every rider remained perfectly still, waiting in complete silence, while the tiny turquoise stone inside Ethan's pocket suddenly felt far heavier than a simple piece of leather ever should. The woman guided her horse to within 20 feet of Ethan's fence before bringing the animal to a gentle stop. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. The morning breeze stirred a loose strand of her dark hair, and the sunlight revealed the calm strength in her face that exhaustion had hidden the day before. Ethan stepped forward slowly, leaving the gate closed between them. He rested one hand on the weathered wood, unsure whether he should offer a greeting or simply wait. She spared him the decision. "You remembered kindness when others remembered fear," she said softly in careful English. Her voice carried neither pride nor sorrow, only quiet certainty. Ethan recognized it immediately. It was the same voice that had spoken no words beside the sandstone cliffs, yet somehow had thanked him all the same. Before he could answer, the distant sound of hurried hoofbeats echoed from the road leading out of Miller's Crossing. Sheriff Amos Granger arrived with nearly a dozen townsmen behind him, each wearing the uneasy expression of people who had imagined far worse during the long morning. The sheriff dismounted before reaching the ranch, removing his hat as his eyes moved from the lone woman to the hundreds of silent riders waiting across the valley. Nobody dared come closer. The older ranchers exchanged nervous glances while whispers drifted through the small crowd like dry leaves in the wind. "This has something to do with Ethan. He found her yesterday. They came because of him." The words spread quickly, growing heavier with every retelling until even those who had not witnessed the meeting accepted them as truth. Sheriff Granger finally cleared his throat. "Miss," he said respectfully, "if there has been some misunderstanding, perhaps we can settle it peacefully." The woman turned toward him with composed eyes. "There has been no misunderstanding." Her answer, though gentle, only deepened the silence. Ethan noticed several townspeople lower their eyes. Others shifted uneasily where they stood. One merchant who had warned Ethan never to help an Apache traveler the previous afternoon quietly removed his hat and held it against his chest without realizing he had done so. The woman slowly dismounted. Her boots touched the ground with measured grace before she walked toward the closed gate. She stopped only a few feet away from Ethan and looked directly at him. "May I have the bracelet?" she asked. Ethan reached into his pocket and carefully placed the worn leather band across his open palm. For a brief moment, she simply stared at it, her fingertips brushing the faded turquoise stone as though greeting an old friend. Then, to the astonishment of everyone watching from the road, she did something no one expected. She bowed her head toward Ethan with quiet respect. It was not dramatic. It was not exaggerated. It was a simple gesture offered with complete sincerity. A murmur swept through the townspeople. Sheriff Granger looked from Ethan to the woman and back again, unable to understand what he had just witnessed. Ethan himself seemed almost embarrassed. "I only shared some water," he said quietly. She lifted her eyes and offered the faintest smile. "You believe you shared water," she replied. "What you truly gave me was time." Before Ethan could ask what she meant, movement rippled through the sea of riders below, as if answering a signal too subtle for anyone else to notice. Every horseman placed a hand over his heart at exactly the same instant. Hundreds of identical movements flowed across the valley without a single spoken command, and the morning sunlight flashed across countless silver bracelets and turquoise stones, each one bearing the same design as the weathered leather band now resting gently in the woman's hands. The woman held the weathered bracelet with both hands for a quiet moment before carefully fastening it around her wrist once again. The faded leather fit perfectly, as though it had never truly belonged anywhere else. She lifted her eyes toward Ethan, and for the first time there was warmth behind her calm expression. "My name is Nayeli," she said. "Yesterday, you did not ask who I was. You only saw someone who needed water." Ethan gave a small nod. It did not seem important at the time. A faint smile touched her face. That is exactly why it mattered. The breeze drifted gently through the valley, carrying the scent of sage and fresh earth, while every rider remained motionless beneath the brightening sky. Sheriff Amos Granger and the townspeople stood in complete silence, sensing they were listening to something far greater than an ordinary conversation. Nayeli looked across the valley toward the waiting horsemen before turning back to Ethan. 3 days ago, I left my people to carry news to my father. Our northern spring has almost disappeared after months without rain. Several families have begun searching for new water before summer arrives. She paused, her fingers resting lightly upon the turquoise stone. On my journey, my horse stumbled among the rocks. I became separated and wandered farther into the desert than I realized. By yesterday afternoon, I had almost no strength left. Ethan remembered the empty canteen hanging beside his saddle. He remembered how little water had remained inside it. Suddenly the choice he had made seemed even smaller than before. Nayeli continued quietly. Many travelers passed me. Some looked away. Some hurried on because they feared what they believed I represented. I do not judge them. Fear often speaks louder than kindness. She looked directly into Ethan's eyes. But you stopped. The words settled over the valley like morning light. One of the older ranchers lowered his head, unable to meet Ethan's gaze. Another quietly removed his gloves, twisting them nervously between his hands. Nayeli took one slow step closer to the gate. This bracelet is not valuable because of the leather or the stone. Every child born into my father's family receives one. It reminds us that the first gift of life is water, and the second is compassion. Without either, no tribe survives for long. Ethan looked at the bracelet with new understanding. It had never been payment. It had been trust. Yesterday, Nayeli continued, I believed my journey had ended beside those rocks. Instead, I reached my people before nightfall. My father was waiting. When he saw the bracelet missing, he feared the worst. When I told him how a stranger had given away his last water without asking for my name, he listened without interrupting. Then he stood and called every family together before the moon reached its highest place. Ethan glanced toward the hundreds of riders filling the valley. All of them came, he asked softly. Nayeli slowly nodded. Not because I am important, because kindness is. The simple answer left no room for pride. It carried only quiet truth. She turned toward the assembled riders, and at that very moment an older man mounted upon a white horse began riding alone through the parted ranks. His silver hair caught the morning sunlight, and every rider lowered his head as he passed. Even before the elder reached the ranch, the entire valley understood that the man approaching carried an authority earned not by fear, but by the respect of every soul who had followed him there. The elder guided his white horse through the open gate without the slightest display of urgency. Time itself seemed to slow around him. His long silver hair rested against a dark buckskin coat decorated only with simple turquoise beads, and although age had bent his shoulders ever so slightly, nothing about him suggested weakness. Every rider in the valley remained seated in complete silence as he approached Ethan's porch. Even Sheriff Amos Granger instinctively removed his hat again. Respect had spread through the valley before a single word had been spoken. The elder brought his horse to a stop, then climbed down with deliberate care. His boots settled onto the earth that surrounded Ethan's humble ranch, and for a brief moment, he simply looked around. His eyes traveled across the weathered barn, the repaired fences, the small vegetable patch beside the cabin, and finally rested upon the nearly empty canteen still hanging beside the front door. A quiet smile appeared. You are Ethan Calloway, he said in calm, measured English. I am Dakota. He did not announce himself as chief. He did not need to. The silence of hundreds behind him had already done that. Ethan nodded respectfully. It is an honor to meet you, sir. Dakota stepped closer until only the wooden gate separated the two men. His weathered hands rested lightly upon the top rail, tracing grooves left by years of sun and rain. Yesterday, he said, my daughter returned carrying life instead of sorrow. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment. I only offered what little water I had left. Dakota shook his head gently. No, You offered the one thing every frightened man believes he cannot spare. Those words drifted across the valley, and more than one townsman quietly looked toward the ground. The chief continued. Many people believe generosity begins when life becomes comfortable. They wait until their pockets are full or their wells overflow. My people teach something different. Kindness has value only when it costs something. Ethan found himself unable to answer. He remembered the weight of that nearly empty canteen in his hand. He had never thought of the choice as extraordinary. It had simply seemed right. Dakota slowly removed a carved wooden staff from the saddle resting beside his horse. The polished cedar glowed warmly beneath the morning sun, its surface engraved with generations of symbols worn smooth by careful hands. Without ceremony or dramatic flourish, he walked to the edge of Ethan's front yard and gently pressed the bottom of the staff into the earth. The sound was little more than soft wood touching dry soil, yet every rider across the valley straightened at the exact same instant. Sheriff Granger glanced around in astonishment. Even the wind seemed to pause. Dakota rested one hand upon the staff and turned toward both the riders and the gathered townspeople. His voice remained steady, never rising above conversation. From this sunrise forward, every trail that crosses our homeland shall remain open to Ethan Calloway. Every hunter, every family, every traveler will know his name. Whoever offers him friendship honors us. Whoever offers him harm will first answer to our respect for the kindness he showed when nobody was watching. No cheers followed. No applause broke the silence. Instead, hundreds of riders quietly lowered their heads together, a gesture so simple and sincere that it carried more weight than any shouted promise. Ethan stood speechless beside his weathered fence while the little ranch he had built with his own hands suddenly became protected by something no amount of money could ever have purchased. The riders did not leave immediately. For several quiet minutes, they remained exactly where they were, filling the valley with a silence that somehow felt warmer than words. Then, almost imperceptibly, Chief Dakota nodded once. It was the only signal anyone needed. One by one, horses turned toward the eastern hills with the same calm discipline that had brought them there before sunrise. There was no celebration, no display of triumph, only the peaceful certainty of people whose purpose had been fulfilled. Dust rose gently beneath thousands of careful hoof steps before drifting into the bright morning air like pale ribbons of smoke. Ethan stood beside his gate watching them disappear, still trying to understand how a single afternoon had transformed the quiet life he had known for years. Sheriff Amos Granger approached him slowly after the last riders had reached the far side of the meadow. The older lawman removed his hat once more, turning it thoughtfully in his weathered hands before speaking. "I have worn this badge for longer than I care to admit," he said quietly. "I have judged plenty of men by what I heard instead of what I knew." He looked toward the empty horizon where the riders had vanished. "This morning reminded me how expensive that mistake can become." Ethan offered only a gentle smile. "We all learn something eventually." The sheriff extended his hand. Ethan accepted it without hesitation. It was a simple handshake, but every rancher and merchant standing nearby understood what it meant. The whispers that had followed Ethan since yesterday faded into an uncomfortable silence. The merchant who had warned him not to stop for the woman finally stepped forward, his eyes fixed upon the ground. "I told you to keep riding," he admitted. "Looks like I was the one who needed better directions." Ethan laughed softly, easing the weight that had settled over everyone. "We all get lost sometimes." The tension dissolved almost instantly. Several neighbors who had rarely visited his ranch before that day quietly offered to help repair an old section of fencing before summer storms arrived. Another rancher insisted on bringing over 2 full barrels of fresh well water that same afternoon. Someone else promised to share hay if the coming season turned dry. None of them spoke about owing Ethan anything. They simply began treating him like the kind of neighbor they wished they had been all along. Over the weeks that followed, small changes spread across the valley almost too gradually to notice. Traders traveling near Apache territory returned speaking of respectful greetings instead of fearful encounters. Families found old trails reopened after years of avoiding them. Hunters crossed distant ridges without feeling watched by unseen suspicion. Whenever someone asked why relations had become calmer, no one could point to a treaty, a meeting, or a signed agreement. The answer always drifted back to one ordinary cowboy who had stopped beside a lonely stretch of desert because another human being looked thirsty. Ethan himself never mentioned the morning when hundreds of riders had filled his valley. If curious travelers asked about the carved cedar staff standing quietly near his front gate, he simply smiled and changed the subject. To him, it was not a monument. It was a reminder. Every evening before sunset, he still filled his canteen from the spring, hung it beside the cabin door, and left a small wooden cup beneath it where any traveler passing through could help themselves without asking. Some paused to drink. Some left a quiet thank you. Others simply continued down the trail. Ethan never asked for their names because he had already learned that sometimes the greatest stories begin long before anyone knows who they are helping. Years passed, and the story traveled farther than Ethan Calloway ever did. It crossed dusty trading posts, quiet ranch kitchens, lonely campfires, and winding trails where strangers exchanged stories beneath endless western skies. Each teller remembered a different detail. Some spoke about the hundreds of riders who had filled the valley without a single shout. Others remembered the carved cedar staff standing beside the old ranch gate. A few insisted they had seen the chief himself ride through town with the dignity of a king. Yet the people who truly understood the story always returned to the same simple beginning. A thirsty woman, an almost empty canteen, one quiet decision. Ethan never considered himself a hero. When children from Miller's Crossing asked whether he had been frightened that morning, he always smiled before looking across the familiar valley. "Of course I was," he would answer. "Being afraid is easy. Deciding anyway is the hard part." The children rarely forgot those words. Neither did their parents. The years slowly changed the land as they always do. Cottonwood trees along the creek grew taller. New fences replaced old ones. The weathered barn received a fresh roof after one particularly rainy spring. Travelers stopped more often at Ethan's ranch than they once had, not because they expected grand stories, but because they knew they would find fresh water waiting beneath the small wooden cup hanging beside the canteen. Sometimes they left a polished stone, sometimes a feather, sometimes nothing at all except quiet gratitude. Ethan accepted every gesture with the same gentle smile. One cool autumn afternoon, long after the valley had returned to its peaceful rhythm, a young ranch hand stopped to refill his horse before continuing west. As he prepared to leave, he noticed the old cedar staff still standing near the front gate, its carvings softened by years of wind and sun. "Mr. Calloway," the young man asked, "why do you never move that staff inside where it will last longer?" Ethan rested one hand against the smooth wood and looked toward the distant horizon where desert met sky. "Because promises belong where everyone can see them," he replied. The young man nodded thoughtfully before riding away, carrying far more than a full canteen. After Ethan passed into old age, neighbors cared for the ranch exactly as he had cared for them. No one removed the cedar staff. No, one took away the wooden cup beneath the hanging canteen. Travelers continued stopping there, many unaware of the full story, yet somehow understanding its meaning the moment they drank from the cool spring water. The valley remained known as one of the safest places to cross for people from every background because trust, once planted with sincerity, often grows deeper roots than fear ever can. And if someone happened to ask why a weathered canteen still hung beside an old cabin long after its owner was gone, the oldest folks in Miller's Crossing would simply smile before telling the tale in the same quiet way it deserved to be remembered. They would say that some men become famous because they won battles, discovered gold, or built great fortunes. Ethan Calloway left behind none of those things. He left behind something far rarer. He proved that a single drink of water, offered without hesitation and without asking who deserved it, could echo across an entire valley for generations. Out on the western frontier, where dust covered every trail and the wind carried every story, people eventually forgot how many riders came that morning. They never forgot why they came.